The RPG genre can seem very intimidating to get into with their long, sometimes 100+ hour lengths, the overwhelming number of options for the player in combat, and complex narratives. It only makes sense that someone out there would want to make a newcomer-friendly game to make the genre more approachable. And what better company to deliver than the one that largely popularized the genre in the West?
Square!
Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was released on the Super Nintendo in 1992, the same year as Final Fantasy IV, which was localized as Final Fantasy II at the time. Even though many liberties were already taken to simplify that game, Square still felt the need to create an even simpler RPG, specifically tailored for the American audience. Now, I don't know about you, but I think FF4 captures the American spirit way more than Mystic Quest, primarily due to the fact that FF4 starts with the good guys invading a country. But lo and behold, Mystic Quest was the game that would end up with USA in the title. You know, to indicate to Japanese players who this game was really made for. The fact that they even felt the need to simplify these types of games for the Western audience kinda makes it sound like Japan thought we were too stupid for JRPGs. You know, that's the joke we've been making for decades at this point, but in retrospect, it may not be as huge of a myth as you'd think. A lot of modern discussion around video games is about how they need to be accessible. And no, most of these people don't mean accommodating for disabilities. The word accessible has taken on a few different meanings over time. Most people using the word accessible when it comes to video games really mean newcomer friendly. There seems to be this expectation that every game, or rather just the popular ones that people will care about, should be designed as though they will be someone's entry point into the series or the RPG genre as a whole. And with that in mind, you know, maybe Square was on to something. They might have been ahead of the curve on this one. Man, I remember back when people on Reset Era were saying they wanted Persona 6 to just be a sequel to Persona 5. But now the general sentiment seems to be that we can't have sequels anymore, because they alienate people who haven't played the first game, and thus end up selling less. Well, worry not, dear viewer. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest has absolutely zero prerequisites to understand its narrative. You want to know what the story of this game is? Restore the power of the crystals. That's it. A Final Fantasy plot stripped down to its bare bones. Hell, this is even simpler than Final Fantasy I's story. Even that game had a twist at the end with endless time loops, which was at least kind of ambitious for its time. Mystic Quest's idea of a shocking last-minute plot twist is that there's a final boss. The story is really more akin to an after-school cartoon with supporting characters that'll come and go as guest party members. The actual characterization of said characters is extremely light. Although I like to imagine that there's at least 2 people out there who really care about these characters. Like, were there shipping wars back then over which girl should be with the protagonist? If there are any Ben Kaylee or Ben Phoebe shippers watching this, please, feel free to argue amongst yourselves for our entertainment. Thank you. They have some semblance of personality, but their roles can largely be boiled down to the friend of today's adventure. I'm not actually all that opposed to this. Trust me, this game likely wouldn't have benefited all that much from having a deeper story. The single premise I just established pretty much explains all the shit gone wrong in this world. The forest withering? Just restore the earth crystal. The lake is frozen? Just restore the water crystal. Wind's out of control? Just restore the wind crystal. Big boulder in your way? Just restore the fire crystal? Sure. This easy to understand explanation for everything helps keep the game's pace consistent. It lets you focus more on your current objective that's tangentially related to the overall plot. Help this character and they'll return the favor somehow, which will help advance your journey. The funny thing about this game is that despite being made with American audiences in mind, the characters still have different names between the English and Japanese versions. The main character, Benjamin, is called Zash in Japanese. Kaylee is Karen. Tristam is Locke, who, funnily enough, is a treasure hunter just like Locke in Final Fantasy VI. Ruben is red, and Phoebe is Fae. Not sure what the point of that was. The Japanese version came out a year after the American release, so I assume they changed them to be easier to pronounce? The Japanese names sound less American and more just like generic fantasy names. But hey, that's just my opinion. Something that I will compliment this game on is that if you're unsure where to go, talking to NPCs around town will usually give you a push in the right direction. Despite being an easy game, it's actually not all too handholdy. Compared to modern game tutorials, at least. On the topic of interacting with things, let's talk about the map design in this game. Starting with the world map. It's basically just a big stage select screen. They either did this because they thought the player would get lost on an actual free roam map, or this was purely a budget cut. Where did that budget go? I don't know, probably the dungeon design. The dungeon design is also probably nothing like what you'd expect in most Final Fantasy games. Something you'll notice pretty quickly is that there's a huge emphasis on interacting with the environment. Outside of battle, weapons are used to progress through dungeons. The axe cuts down stumps, bombs can open up passages, the sword activates switches, the claw helps you climb walls, the works. They're just more akin to something like Zelda dungeons as opposed to Final Fantasy. Mario stage select screen, Zelda-like dungeons where you use different weapons to navigate through dungeons and puzzles, Mickey Mouse-ass plot. And I'm talking even more Mickey Mouse than Kingdom Hearts, a game that actually has Mickey Mouse in it. It feels like this game's way of accommodating for newcomers is implementing surface-level things from games the Western audience would be more familiar with. That being said, the dungeon design isn't terrible. It's actually quite interesting for a Super Nintendo game. My only real complaint is enemy placement. So I guess Square knew those silly gaijins would hate random encounters with every fiber of their being. They were pretty on the nose with that one. So instead, they implemented field encounters. This might be one of the first instances I've ever seen them. There's no ambushing the enemy from behind or anything. Whether you or the enemy strikes first is random, as far as I can tell. You just press A or push in the direction of the enemy to start the encounter. This sounds nice on paper, but this actually ends up making enemies feel like a nuisance. See, the enemies don't actually move around the field like other games that would use this method. They are completely static. Not only that, but many of them will straight up block the path. This includes both the actual path and all the branching paths that just lead to treasure or pitfalls, or the bottom floor you need to climb out of after falling down the pitfall. You can skip out on a few encounters, but the game definitely wants you to fight a certain amount of them so you're not too underleveled for the boss at the end. So you actually end up with more mandatory encounters than in a game with random encounters. That's not to say that random encounters are always better, I'm just saying the way encounters are handled in this specific context is worse. The encounters also respawn when you exit and re-enter the dungeon, so make sure you're stacked on items so you don't have to leave the dungeon and come back in. It's not hard, they're pretty cheap and you shouldn't have any trouble affording it. And even if you do, the game has a built-in solution for that too. The enemies aren't the only thing that respawn. So do the chests. If you're really that starved for cash, you can enter the first floor of a dungeon, hell, just enter a town, and collect all the chests over and over again. The only chests that don't respawn are equipment and key items, which are permanently added to your inventory. And on that note, can we just take a minute to appreciate that money is considered part of your status? Probably the most American thing in this game. Turn-based combat, the bread and butter of the classic JRPG. I don't know who the hell thought this, but I guess the devs figured that there's too much management in other games of the genre. Therefore, Mystic Quest decides it wants to be the lowest maintenance RPG to ever exist. Since I just mentioned equipment, we might as well start there. You don't equip weapon or armor upgrades, they're just automatically applied to you. Any further upgrades kinda just stack their new effects and resistances on top of your existing ones. There's no real thought that goes into your resistances, as you never need to choose between them. You just accumulate more over time. Same applies to magic. All of them are just found in dungeons, but equipment upgrades and magic aren't always on the beaten path. This incentivizes the player to explore dungeons thoroughly and consequently fight more encounters. The combat itself is essentially a scaled down version of what you'd get out of other RPGs. The cap for all enemy encounters is 3, and the player side has just the protagonist and one other guest member. These characters serve 2 purposes. They not only help you in battle, but also introduce new tools for the player to use, be it a new type of weapon or whatever spells they have on hand. Party members will come and go, but the game is designed around whatever party members join and leave you in the moment. Except for Ruben, he kinda sucks. Cool design though. By pressing Y, you can toggle your partner between auto or manual control. The first half of the game is so agonizingly easy, you might as well just leave them on autopilot. In short, the party AI is smart enough to spot weaknesses, know when to use healing items, and always go for the kill if an enemy is close to death. If you do end up getting wiped, it's honestly of no consequence. You're given the option to retry the fight right away. This applies to both normal and boss encounters, despite the fact that you can save anywhere in this game. One really cool thing about this game, like genuinely, is how every enemy has different sprites for when they're low on health. Bosses even have multiple sprites for multiple HP thresholds. A nice beginner-friendly way to indicate how close the enemy is to defeat without the need for visible health bars. This charm can only carry you so far though. About 5 feet actually. I'll be honest, the combat and frequency of battles in this game almost made me drop it. The game was just so brainless at the beginning that I had to play this game in shorter recording sessions than I usually do. I was literally mashing A with speed up. It almost frustrates me that this was meant to be an introductory game for the RPG genre, because it sets the false pretense that turn-based combat is just mindless A button mashing. How does this at all teach the player about how RPG battle systems typically work? But somehow, by some miracle, I worked up the motivation to boot up the game again, and I noticed something changed. Or rather, I noticed things adding up. As I was mindlessly mashing away, I noticed encounters were taking longer. Hell, there were even a few instances where I lost, but kept mashing retry just to repeatedly smash my head against a wall, without noticing until my 2nd or 3rd death. So what was happening? I was getting screwed by status ailments without noticing. Not just directly getting inflicted with them, but contracting them through contact. Yes, some enemies can passively inflict status ailments on you if you hit them with a melee weapon. So I had to keep this in mind and switch to using my bombs or spells on these types of enemies. But of course, this didn't fix the problem of them just casting status ailments the old-fashioned way. I had to take out these encounters more quickly and efficiently. Not necessarily out of fear of dying or losing, but purely just to save time. Less time spent trying to finish off enemies, less time spent healing after battle, more time spent progressing. This might seem like a pretty small thing, and ultimately I'll admit this only turned a brain-dead game into an easy one, but that's not a bad thing. What matters isn't if the game crushes my balls or not. What matters is if the game puts up enough resistance to keep me engaged. Just adding the extra step of considering which weapon to strike with, or which enemy to target, was enough to keep my attention. I was thinking about things like which of my characters should heal this turn. Both of my characters can exploit the weakness of one enemy, but only Benjamin can exploit this other enemy's weakness. I don't want to trigger this enemy's counterattack, so I should cast a spell instead of using my weapon. These things don't make the game challenging per se, but the fact that the game even considers these things in an entry-level game is honestly kinda respectable. A lot of RPGs don't even do anything meaningful with different weapon types. Most of them are just an aesthetic assigned to a certain character. The sword character, the punchy character, etc. But here, you have a protagonist with a whole arsenal to choose from, and no weapon becomes truly obsolete. Except for your sword for a decent chunk of the game before Excalibur. Then it becomes your best weapon. These types of little decisions are actually a good thing to introduce to newcomers of the genre, because while not all RPGs have this layer to their combat, I can think of a couple games where switching out your weapon for certain enemies would certainly make the experience more smooth. They even included undead enemies taking damage from cure spells. That's a pretty advanced mechanic to be showing beginners, but it's there for them to discover. And if they play any other Final Fantasy games after this, they'll know that it works there too. The really sad thing is that I can actually see this being too much management for some people in 2026. The game gave me a new weapon, so I shouldn't have to switch back to my other ones. I can see a good chunk of players getting too used to mindlessly mashing, like the first half of the game conditions you to, then getting frustrated once they get to the more considerately designed parts of the game because they can't do that anymore. It's not like the game only just introduces these things now, they've always been present. It just never felt necessary to keep in mind until halfway through the game. The one compliment I have for the combat is the part with the highest likelihood of turning people away. Task successfully failed. But now to answer the burning question, should beginners actually start with this game? Well, a while back I asked my audience what their first RPG was, as well as what RPG they'd recommend to newcomers as a starting point. And absolutely zero of you mentioned this game. Hell, most of you probably came to the conclusion way earlier in this video that this game is probably not a good entry point. I guess the real question we should be asking is, why? Well, I can think of a few things. It honestly feels like the game is trying to compromise with its audience by integrating design choices from other genres. Armor is boiled down to straight upgrades. Spells are more like power-ups you find throughout levels. A lot of the decision-making outside of just which weapon or spell to attack with isn't there. There's no character speccing, no overworld exploration either. It's reduced down to a mostly linear hub world. Sure, some elements that keep the spirit of an RPG adventure are still there, but it feels like a very surface-level imitation. It's just not an accurate representation of the genre. The best way to approach this game and get the most enjoyment out of it is to expect something completely different. What makes Final Fantasy Mystic Quest interesting is what it does differently from other RPGs, rather than its attempts to be an introductory level game. Sure, that'll always be an important part of its identity, and you should keep that intent in mind as you play, but effectively, it's best viewed as an interesting experiment that loosely outlines the RPG genre, but doesn't even begin to explain the half of it. See that was a little self-plagiarism from my backlogged review there. Don't worry, I gave myself permission.